All right, welcome everyone. Please be seated so we can get started. Thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining this afternoon. We are so pleased to see you. My name is Joyce Petrella. I'm the president of the Charter Oak State College Foundation, who is sponsoring this event this evening. I am so thrilled to see this response. We have about 100 in this room, give or take 10 or so, and another 100 or so online, which is pretty remarkable. We've held these series called the Shea Lecture for over 16 years, and we've never had this kind of response. So we know that we're onto something here, and I want to thank both Carol and Taylor, who you see in the room here. Carol, raise your hand. Thank you so much for coordinating this effort. The title of this session, of course, is Bridging Perspectives, the Art of Civil Discourse. And as you can imagine, this type of response tells us that we've struck a nerve. We've struck a chord with all of you. And that's really important for us to know that. And we really want you to walk away with tactical, practical types of techniques that you can use when you get back. We're all facing the holidays. We know that this can be a very divisive time for all of us. So I want you to be able to feel confident that you can be at the Thanksgiving table, people that might not necessarily agree with us, but you want to be able to have that relationship that will sustain us across years and years ahead of time. So before we get started, I also want to thank the Shea family, who is funding this event as part of their endowment to their father. Dr. Bernard Shea was the first president of Charter Oak State College, and he was the one that started this online notion of online and accreditation of your credits so that you could finally achieve a degree. Pretty remarkable at the time, which was over, how many years, Carol? 50 years ago, which is really pretty remarkable. So for those who are online that are part of the Shea family, we thank you, because this is pretty remarkable. I also want to send a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this evening. That includes Liberty Bank, Jay Pushoda, the Fiducian Advisors, Community Foundation of Greater New Britain, Guru Enterprises, and all of you. We really do thank you for coming tonight, and everyone online as well. We have a very exciting and stimulating agenda. So we're going to move on very, very quickly, but I just want to give you a few housekeeping rules, because I think it'll be important for us to, because we have a lot of din in this room, and it's really important. So please, so that the Wi-Fi will work and that everything is copacetic, we really want to make sure that you turn your phones off or just on mute or just non-ring, so that we'll be able to stay engaged and continue the dialogues that we're having. The restrooms are right outside the door, so you'll find them very readily, pretty straightforward. And you probably, as you were walking in, spied over to my right, your left, the bar. These are mocktails, because we want you all to enjoy the evening, as well as to be able to have some civil discourse, right? So you will take a look and you'll see they're very aptly named, and we really appreciate that. They're purposeful. There'll also be coffee, as you can see in the back, and we'll have some appetizers working around the room as we go forward. So without further ado, I want to, introduce our speaker and facilitator for this evening, Yvonne Alston. Yvonne is the CEO and Chief Culture Architect and founder of the Indelible Impressions Consulting. Yvonne's expertise lies in organizational culture and addressing issues both in the workplace and types of dynamics, right? We are excited to have her because it expands beyond the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
As I mentioned, it expands into our homes, into our families, as well as all of our networks that we have in our lives. So we're particularly finding that this is timely and very important for the work that we're all doing. I guarantee you're going to walk away from today's session to be at least better informed and actually equipped to hold civil discourses and conversations of topics that sometimes divide us. So with that, I thank you, Yvonne. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joyce. Awesome. And thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to start off by saying a really heartfelt moment of gratitude this is for me, for those who are in the room, as well as those who are online, for participating in this critical and courageous conversation. It's not a light thing that you have chosen to spend your time with us this evening, whether that's out of sheer curiosity, at the behest of a friend, a colleague, or a loved one, or out of concern for our humanity and the civil discourse that impacts it. So I thought it would be appropriate to just lay the foundation of what is civil discourse. Well, in its most simplistic definition, it's respectful conversations aimed at understanding our different viewpoints as well as finding common ground with one another, our fellow humans. And I think we can probably all agree that it is a very relevant need during this time, as well as a hot topic today, whether that's in our workplaces, at our dinner tables, or in our community conversations. And we only need to look to pretty much any form of media, whether that's social media, newspapers for those who still read them, whether you get them online or not, that it all confirms that civil discourse in our society has changed, and unfortunately, it is very much a lost art form in America and abroad. When we think about how much so, I was able to pull some data on this that I found rather shocking. And so the state of civil discourse is increasingly under threat. 73% of Americans believe that civility has declined in public discourse over the last decade alone. 73%. That's a lot. 60% feel uncomfortable discussing politics with friends or family because they're afraid of it resulting in conflict and it negatively impacting our relationships. And during the last annual meeting of Learn, Serve, and Lead, for which Dr. Cornell West and Dr. David Skorton sit on, they noted that getting back to civil discourse will require something significant of all of us. And those things are vulnerability and humility. And so we have to understand that we are in many respects, a painfully divided America. And our ability to return to the art of civil discourse requires that people on all sides of issues, across all divides of identity, make themselves vulnerable to be able to be challenged by one another and to challenge some of our most deeply held convictions, to adopt humility for the fact that we might be wrong about some things, and respect humanity for those who might disagree with us. It's critical to our ability to engage in constructive discussions, whether that's on our ideologies, social issues, politics, healthcare, religion, and so much more. In my team at Indelible Impressions on our work, we have the privilege, and I really do consider it a privilege, to be able to engage in what some might presume are touchy or tough conversations. And some of my clients are in the room tonight, which is awesome, so thank you for your support. But they see this work up close and firsthand. And it really is this work, when you think about it, really rooted in the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The diversity of our identities and how those lived experiences through those identities informs our perspectives, informs how we show up, or perhaps don't, to certain conversations, to different topics, and what our take on them are, and how they impact the human condition, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in our neighborhoods, or even within our family structures. So why is civil discourse important to our society? Because perspective sharing really impacts our personal and professional growth. It benefits us to challenge ourselves. And believe it or not, to challenge one another in meaningful ways, because that's actually what helps to deepen our connection to one another. It is through the striving of these types of conversations that actually creates intimacy between us and helps to break down barriers and polarizations that are occurring based on what we think and what we feel. And why it's difficult is because of the human condition, right? Civil discourse requires that we acknowledge that truth can be many-sided and sometimes even a bit elusive. We often disagree about what key concepts mean, how to evaluate the relevant evidence of someone's argument, and how to weigh competing values against each other. Civil discourse, therefore, requires that we embrace some principles. One of those is fallibilism, that human beings, in our human condition, we get things wrong sometimes. Pluralism, that people of goodwill often can reach different conclusions, again, based on their own lens and their own experiences. And that we need flexibility. We need flexibility in our thinking, in our perspective sharing, and to admit that our current beliefs could use some room for growth. So we need to be wholly committed to this art of civil discourse, our ability to more deeply connect to one another in meaningful ways. One book that I have been reading that I am thoroughly enjoying is by Monica Guzman, who is a bridge builder. She's a journalist, she's a professor, and she lives by a mantra I wholly believe in, that there is an art to great conversation as well as curious questions. And I think we could all stand to be a little bit more curious these days. Her book is entitled, I Never Thought of It That Way, How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times, which really focuses and emphasis on curiosity and conversation as tools for healing social divides. So when thinking about that dynamic of the social divides, how our attitudes, our habits, and our beliefs become almost entrenched and aligned, sometimes almost tribal in some respects. It's hard to think about, to change our entrenchments that sometimes are wholly and unilaterally unlikely to change if we only keep our communities thinking and feeling the way that we do. And so I believe that this conversation tonight with the esteemed panel is going to bring to light an opportunity for us to think broadly, to reflect more deeply. And you're actually going to get an opportunity at your tables once we get done with the panel discussion to actually engage in this beautiful art of civil discourse. And so it's our diverse networks and communities that are critical to allowing us to be more open and expansive. And I hope that we will take advantage of that opportunity tonight to get to know your table mates, to learn something meaningfully about them, how they live, and what that lived experience looks like from their lens, and how you can have a discussion on a topic that maybe you have a particular standpoint on or none at all. But it will be through conversation that we are able to develop the skills that are needed to go forth as we are coming into an election cycle, as the holidays, as Joyce mentioned, are coming up, and we're going to have family members gathered around tables that are going to have conversations about what might be tough topics. And so with that, I'd like to welcome to our podium Elise Wright, who is the CCSU Regent, HR and Leadership Consultant. Thank you, Elise. We also have Jay Williams, CEO, Harvard Foundation for Public Giving. And Carlos Soler, faculty and student advisor at CCSU. I want to thank you so much for their time, for their energy to have this very important conversation. They all bring unique perspectives based on their roles, based on their identities, based on their lived experiences. So, Jay, I'd like to start with you, actually. As the president and CEO of the Harvard Foundation for Public Giving, and knowing your commitment to dismantling structural racism, achieving equity, and improving social and economic mobility in our region, I imagine that you have led one of many community conversations. What do you feel is a lead barrier to having civil discourse when opposing viewpoints are very present and folks are quite kind of entrenched in their thinking and their ideologies and perspectives?
Yvonne, thank you for the question, and I'm glad to be here with all of you and certainly with the fellow panelists, and looking to both learn first and foremost and then share. In direct response to your question, I think there are two things that jump out to me based on my experience that are barriers to having civil discourse. The first is a part of human nature, is our inclination not necessarily to check our own biases when we are about to engage in a conversation that may be uncomfortable or that may have a lot of potential landmines. So I think we go into it perhaps with good intentions, but not with an honest assessment of the biases that we carry based on our own experiences and thinking. And the second thing is we often go into this with the goal of trying to persuade the other party to see our views. And that in and of itself is a barrier that will often automatically put the other person on the defensive, is having that goal to persuade. So in order to have a civil dialogue, I think that you have to have genuine, authentic, and you said this word, curiosity, which is different than conditional curiosity. Sometimes we're willing to be conditionally curious. Well, I'm curious to the condition, on the condition that I can then understand where you're coming from, so I then can get to that notion of persuading you, as opposed to being just curious to understand that person's views, rationale, perspective, why they think what they think, and that be the end of it. Not with the condition, now that you've given me that, I have a better opportunity to try to persuade you. So I'll end by saying, understanding our own biases that we all have. We all have them, as well-intended as we might be, and then not going into those conversations with a explicit or even a subtle goal to try to persuade, but being willing to just be curious for the sake of learning and understanding, and having that be a satisfactory outcome, perhaps, of a civil discourse.
I appreciate that framing so much. At Indelible, we talk about courageous curiosity, because oftentimes it does take courage in order for us to sit in spaces within that discomfort that you mentioned, and to not have an agenda, to truly engage in active listening. And that is a skill set that I think is really important to folks. From your perspective, Carlos, I know that in our panel prep, you and I talked about outcomes-based approaches to courageous conversations. And certainly on college campuses right now, students, especially the current generation, not only are they curious, but they're not afraid to share their perspectives at all. For you, in terms of advancing student engagement, what are some of the tough topics that you're hearing about in terms of addressing needs of students, and how does that align with what Jay was saying from a curiosity standpoint?
Thank you for the questions. But before I go into that, I want to first talk about why are we here? We're in this capacious room, but why are we here? How are we here in the United States? And I think the book Why Nations Fail just won Nobel Prize for Economics. And in that book, they talk about, the difference between poor nations and rich nations. And basically, they broke it down to two parts. And those two parts was one was inclusive, the other one was more extractive. Extractive, it hinders growth. It hinders innovation, and that's why some of the states fail and some of the nations fail. In inclusive nations, similar to ours, there's innovation and there is room for growth. Everybody gets treated the same. There's no special privileges for anybody. Why is this important? Because in the book, they talk about critical junctures of a nation. And when a critical juncture happens in a nation, it kind of makes the nation go one way or another. And for us, when it comes to civil discourse, we had a critical juncture, I believe, and it comes more cogently by Dr. Warshauer, one of our CCSU instructor, who wrote a book called Creating and Failing the 9/11 Generation. And he talks about 9/11. And how 9/11 became a crucial part of our nation. And within that juncture, there was a second juncture, which was when George Bush had had the axis of evil message to the what's that called? He put it out, axis of evil. I'm losing the word. I'm getting nervous here.
Don't be nervous. We're all friends here.
So in that, he basically says it's either us or them. It's good against evil. It's black and white. There's no gray area, and we're going to do whatever we need to do in order to overcome this challenge. What does that do? What did that do to our nation? It polarized us. Yeah. Not only did it polarize us, so you look at international, it polarized international. And what we did, which Dr. Warshauer makes a brilliant conversation about this, where he says that even to France, when France told us not to fly over their airspace, not to utilize it, how we retaliate against them. What does that do to a nation and to young people when they're seeing our own government not being able to be civil with other countries? Okay? So when we're thinking about these junctures and why is it important for us to know this, now we have to look at the past and kind of say, okay, how can we learn from the past so that we don't recreate the same mistakes that we did in the future? So looking at both of these books, and again, Creating a Failing Nation by 9/11 Generation, awesome book. I think everybody should have a go at it and take a read because there's a lot of learning to happen there. So going to your question, what are some of the topics that we are discussing? So some of the topics that a lot of the students are facing nowadays and universities are facing as a whole is the academic freedom versus safe space versus free speech. When you think about all of those, these are certain things that are happening on college campuses that are creating, sometimes dividing, and sometimes putting people, uniting people. University presidents lost their jobs because of this. Okay, students are mobilizing, they're doing encampments. On the other end, there's other students who are being able to have conversations. They're going online and they're creating safe spaces to be able to have these conversations, to be able to learn from each other. So what I've done in the past is being able to work with students. My master's is in student development. So how can you make it an engaging environment, fun activity that students can learn from? And in order for us to kind of understand each other, let's find what those commonalities are. Let's find that common ground. So just like a game that you get in a circle and you say things. How many of us have brothers? Everybody go step in, step out. How many of us have sisters? So we start looking at the commonalities. So we start learning from each other to not say the black or the white. There's more gray, there's more in common than we have differences. So then therefore, another topic that we are facing in the university and overall is social media, as you alluded to, and echo chambers within social media. If we're always hearing what we want to hear and the algorithm is giving you what you think and not hearing other things, then you may close yourself off. So then therefore, activities that are helping young people to see the other perspective is getting themselves out of those echo chambers, putting their phones away and being able to have conversations. It's easy for us to do a lot of this, and we are so many of us, so many young people are so glued to their phone. The addiction is so deep that it's hard for them to even leave the phone down without picking it up for 20 minutes. So again, topics that we are addressing now is the freedom of speech, safe space, having people feel comfortable in an environment without feeling attacked. Academic freedom, instructors being able to teach a specific course or a specific topic without feeling that they're going to lose their jobs because a student doesn't feel comfortable in that class because they're learning something which is challenging for them. All right? And as I mentioned earlier, being able to stay away from the echo chambers and being able to get different perspectives.
Yeah. I think that's wholly important. I know that as we were discussing, we all kind of gathered together to give our perspectives on different aspects. And one of the things I'd like to pivot to Elise now, we talked about is how important authenticity is in the realm of these types of conversations. How do you think, whether it's a student, whether it's someone in a workplace or a community setting like this, how do you think that folks can best honor that authentic voice and perspective while engaging in discussions where you might have very different perspectives, you might have very different lived experiences that are coloring that approach?
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here. I had to say one thing to Carlos. As you were talking about sort of the culture and what students are experiencing, I felt like I was catapulted back into the 70s when I went to high school and college. So there are some similarities. I realize there are some very big differences. When we talked a little bit about sort of where I worked during my career for a very long time, and there weren't, at that point when I first entered the workforce, there weren't a lot of women or people of color who were in the types of jobs that I ended up sitting in. If you are talking about business and there are facts that are indisputable, you can have a discussion about, for example, how you achieve your financial margins. That's, you can have animated discussions or very spirited discussions. What I find is more difficult is some of which each of my colleagues mentioned. When they get to personal issues and you're talking about things that reflect or your opinions reflect your life experience, that's where it becomes a little dicey. So if you, just as an example, if in my business, if we were talking about let's broaden the outreach and see if we can bring people with different types of experiences into the workforce, the knee-jerk reaction sometimes was, but that's not where I went to school, or that's not what my experience is.
Right.
I don't understand that. So it became very personal, as if to say, if you don't agree with me, then therefore you are wrong. I find the best way to deal with that and sort of generate an authentic conversation is to use fact-based information. I realize that is difficult now because the access to information is so widespread.
Yes.
And it's targeted to people based on what their interests are. So you can have a very narrow perspective. But if people are willing, I think if you present facts, it becomes a little bit easier to have that discussion. And I think civil discourse, and we talked about this, doesn't necessarily mean that we have these kumbaya experiences and we all hold hands.
That's right.
Those discussions can be very spirited.
Correct.
And they can be very, sort of I call it animated. But if it's respectful,
Yeah.
then I think, and if you're listening, and I think it requires listening. And Jay, you talked about something about when people come at this, like if I can get this information and then sort of get them to understand my point. Or
Right.
prove my
Convert
point.
them to my way of
Convert them
thinking.
to my way of thinking.
Yeah.
And it's about stepping back and saying, listening. And if the information that's being presented by the person who has a different perspective, can you think about it?
Yeah.
And some people you can do that with. And other people, they're so ingrained with their beliefs.
Yeah.
And they're so bombarded with information that may or may not be accurate, it's more challenging. So while the experiences I had that Carlos talked about in the 70s, people didn't have the access to information that was online, that was on their phone, that was on the news, the 24-hour news cycle where people give opinions as opposed to perhaps presenting the facts.
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge in terms of having those real conversations, those authentic conversations. And it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's challenging. And so I think people have a propensity of sometimes wanting to be around people who think just like them.
Yeah. And that aligns with what was said about the echo chambers, right? Are we just our social world, our workplace world, if we're not careful, it becomes homogeneity. It becomes people who look like us, people who live like us. And you don't get those differing perspectives that are so important. One of the things you also talked about just now, and I think is thematic for the three of you, is the dynamic of almost what is truth today. In this world where we talk about alternative facts that aren't evidence-based, that aren't scientifically validated in some way, there are a lot of opinions that are put forth as though they are fact. How do we navigate that in the course of civil discourse and having these discussions when something might feel or sound very outlandish, misaligned with data that you might have proof of a particular point? How do we navigate that?
I believe is you have to get the facts out. And if you're having a discussion with someone and they present something that is just not true, I think presenting the factual information is helpful. It gets difficult, and I think we talked about this a little bit, to have a conversation with somebody, and if it's the information is so untrue, so extreme, I think for me, I have to make the decision about whether I want to engage in this conversation or if I want to step away. I'm not going to have, I think I said this when we met, I'm not going to have a conversation about certain groups of people eating cats and dogs. I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah.
But I can have a conversation, I think, Jay, you said this, about immigrants and people who are legally in this country and legally working in jobs, and we can have a discussion about the impact on the infrastructure and have that debate about whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But, you know, if it gets to the point that there's information that is so bizarre, for me, I step away. I'm not going to have that conversation. But it's hard to argue facts. What concerns me sometimes, though, is that in certain places, in certain educational facilities, and Carlos touched upon this, there's constraints being put on academics, faculty, students, in the workplace, what they can and cannot talk about.
Yeah.
And that concerns me because that limits how much information you can put forth, because it may offend somebody. It may make somebody feel uncomfortable. I mean, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and I think I was exposed to more accurate information, and we had the opportunity to think about, you know, to explore, to think, to challenge, than I see that some folks that I know have in their school systems today, because the concern is about how do you balance the different perspectives of individuals and not offend anybody.
Yeah. Jay.
Elisa is so right. There are a set of facts that exist in our society, in our world, and our history that are just indisputable. And it is so powerful and so indisputable that there's been a conscious effort to gray that notion by a phrase that came up a few years ago about alternative facts. There are no such thing as alternative facts. There are alternative opinions.
Correct.
There are
Well
alternative
said.
interpretations, but there aren't alternative facts. And facts are so powerful. That's why that effort to say, well, there's an alternative set of facts, because once you have a set of facts that are indisputable, you know, again, we can debate about the impact of what happened. We can debate about the origins of what happened, but, you know, certain things happen in the history of this country, and that is just not up for dispute. And because of that, you know, this cynical attempt to lay out a different set of facts to shift the conversation and shift the narrative, which then again undermines what we are here to talk about, civil discourse. Because you're right, we can't have a debate about whether the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I mean, that's just not a debate we can have. There's plenty of room to debate about, you know, the effects of climate change and things like that. But when people start to muddle those things, it is a conscious effort to really distract, and it should be seen as a red herring. And you touched on this, when, you know, you have news and you have opinion, and then those things become merged in a very gray area, people start to then want to believe someone who is presenting an opinion in a very fact-like way, presenting opinion in shrouded in what could easily be interpreted as news. People say, well, that's the news, and it's not. And there used to be a time in this country where there was a clear demarcation between news, and you talked about this, and between people who were espousing their opinion. And over the course of the past couple of decades, probably most specifically in the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a conscious effort to gray those things. And in doing that, it has been part of this effort to create what people would want you to believe is an alternative set of facts. So I think I just love the way you phrase it. There are some conversations, I agree with you, that I'm not going to engage in. I'm going to engage to the point of establishing a set of facts, but once I see, you know, that the other side is not interested in facts, but instead of laying out a narrative, that is, you know, not a good use of my time. I think it is only going to result in, again, either me then trying to persuade and that's not what if I'm engaging in civil discourse, that's not what I want to do. I want to understand why someone who is different thinks the way they do. I want to understand their perspectives, because part of it goes to what you said. It helps me maybe challenge my own thinking. Well, Jay, I've had a long held belief, but if I do my active listening, perhaps my belief needs to be modified or shifted. But that's a conversation and a process I need to go through on my own, or being willing to be vulnerable, as you talked about. But just this notion, you know, you can't dispute actual facts. You can dispute a lot of things around that, and you know, just not accepting this notion of alternative facts is again one of those core principles I think we have to start at. And nowadays, too many people are unwilling to do that, and oftentimes it's cynical. It's not a genuine. It's a cynical notion of trying to set a different fact pattern and then go from there.
I just want to add one thing. When people hold certain beliefs to be absolutely true, I think they become very vulnerable to information that if it aligns with their thinking,
Confirmation bias.
and they're going to stick with it.
Yeah.
And with the amount of information that people are receiving,
Yeah.
and the targeting of those individuals, it becomes extremely challenging to be able to say, I know that you're saying this is an absolute fact,
Yeah.
but here's another perspective. And I worry about if we continue to see sort of the screening of what information, I mean, I said it before, what I learned thinking through high school, well, grammar school, high school, college. College was the place where you experimented in thinking, and you were presented with information that, for me, that I'd never heard before. Different perspectives, people from all different parts of the country.
Yeah.
And I, you know, I don't know if that is the case as much as it was during the time that, you know, sort of we saw legislations change to give people more opportunities, have access to more information, have more privileges, have more rights. And so, and when I see that some of that eroding, I think it then has the potential of having a negative effect
Yeah.
on sort of having that real, genuine discussion with people.
Yeah. Carlos, from your perspective, from some of the barriers that exist within academic institutions, right? And folks' ability to have those conversations, folks to be open and genuinely curious, which I think is something that we could all stand to do a lot more of. What are you finding is the appetite of institutions to allow for that to really flourish. Elise is talking about a time when I think in school where students could ask questions and they could challenge differently than students are today, certainly of faculty and so forth. What are you seeing as it relates to that? What is the appetite of institutions to really allow this to grow and expand?
I think it's even more challenging today than it was in the past. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are losing their jobs. They're losing their ability to feed their family if cancel culture continues to go rampant. So,
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a big issue.
universities also, are looking to continue to have a robust student body. They want to make sure that they keep everybody safe in a safe environment. However, how do you balance, somebody's safe space with an instructor's academic freedom? And that's really, really challenging. You have, instructors who've been teaching a certain subject for a lot of years. Now this new student, the student who comes in who is paying for an experience, who now doesn't feel comfortable in that classroom because of that subject, that's very, very challenging to regulate through our entire campus, never alone an entire system like the CSCU system. Extremely challenging. And I think what it boils down to is helping young people become cognitive and emotionally adaptive, cognitive and emotionally flexible, helping young people become self-regulated and self-aware. And if you utilize those methods like using, again, games to helping them to feel safe and have a good time, while at the same time they're learning and they're experiencing something, you allow them to kind of grow in a space while at the same time they don't feel threatened by that subject or that conversation. And they could be able to hold on a conversation because you've been able to kind of level the playing field in many ways. For educational leaders, it is extremely, extremely important to create that environment. Extremely difficult to make as well. It costs a lot of money as well to create those, because you have to hire the right people and the right time and be able to use those programmings. So I think it's currently it's our obligation to be able to do that, because if we don't take care of this now and we don't start having these conversations and helping the next generation to be able to feel safe and grow and have experiences that allows them to think critically and to become self-aware, then we end up shooting ourselves in the foot in many ways. So we're looking to continuously do that at the university, at Central. There's other universities that are doing things a little bit differently. That's what I've been able to do when I'm working with students.
Yeah. Elise, the dynamic of cancel culture, right? I often think that it is part and parcel of the issue that we're having right now, our ability to have civil discourse. People are worried about what are going to be the impacts to my professional reputation, or what are people going to say online about me that could create some levels of harm, that could negatively impact relationships. How do you see cancel culture as it relates to workplaces and certainly within communities where you're having certain conversations?
First, I have to say that, and my age and my experience may be showing, I think that we have to manage ourselves. And sometimes people put themselves in a situation. Now, when you put something online, it's there forever.
Yeah.
For everybody to see. It can be shared. And there's not a way you can take it away. I don't care if it's text, I don't care. And I remember when I worked for a corporation, we used to say, if you don't want it to be on the front page, I know everyone doesn't read
Don't put it
newspapers.
in writing.
Don't put it in writing, just
Right.
don't do that. And it would never cease to amaze me how many people would put an email out there or say something, or be recorded saying something that was detrimental to their reputation. So I think that's one is, you have to manage yourself and think about it. And I know it's challenging, Carlos, you said with the kids with the phones, it's, kids in my family, I take the phone away. and just say, let's have a conversation. Turn
Yeah.
off the television, whatever. So you have to do that. There are some times that it amazes me that some things that may not be, in my opinion, that damning, how it destroys a reputation and how it affects the job, it affects relationships. And so I'm not sure that I know how to manage this because it's just exploded to the point that I think people are being extremely cautious in some circumstances, but that caution sometimes prevents you from being very candid and open about having a discussion with someone about a subject that may be sensitive or where your opinion may be very different than the person that you need to have a discussion with. I think it's made people gun shy. I think it's made teaching very difficult. As a parent, I think it's difficult to figure out the best way that you raise an issue without somebody taking offense to it. I think we're very litigious. And so people are fearful about, am I, not only my personal reputation, but are there financial challenges that can happen if I say or do something that offends somebody? I don't know that I have a solution, but I do think where I'm most worried about it, I know I'm harping on this, is in the school systems, because that's where young people learn to think and develop and come up with ideas, and they make mistakes, and you should learn from your mistakes. But if you're so concerned about whether, if I present a certain course to, or even I present a certain book to be read, and then there is one person, one parent who takes exception to that, what's the effect on that? And in some cases, we've seen people have been terminated from their jobs, or they've been made to feel so uncomfortable that they can't remain in the job, or the book cannot be read in the schools.
The book banning.
I saw the list of banned books.
Yeah.
And it's to me, it's absurd because, again, I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and half of those books were required reading. So, and I always thought that my education, that I went through such a strict upbringing.
Yeah.
So it's just, I don't know that I have the solution. I think it's challenging. I think Carlos talked about some things that you were doing at Central. And I'm sure that there are educators who are trying to figure out a way to navigate through this, but it's far more difficult than it was.
In conclusion, and I know that we're coming up on time, the notion of discomfort, I have the perspective that we should all be leaning into discomfort more because discomfort is the place of growth. If there's something that feels uncomfortable to us, it's more than likely something we don't know yet or something we haven't experienced yet, and that's okay. So discomfort is necessary. What are your individual perspectives about what are your perspectives about discomfort and how to overcome the notion that it's okay for me to rely on discomfort to disengage and not have certain conversations?
I'll just start, and I think it ties into what we're just talking about, the safe space. I've wrestled a long time with this notion of the safe space as it's been defined over the past decade or so. And I'll tie it directly to your notion of discomfort. My wife and I have a 14-year-old son. We want him to be in environments where he is respected and valued, but not necessarily. And when I say safe, I don't mean physical violence, because when he goes out into the world isn't always full of safe spaces. The world is a very diverse and rich place, but someone used the term adaptive, and that's where it comes to discomfort, being able to adapt to that notion of being uncomfortable. Physicians and physiologists will tell you when you're exercising isn't always comfortable. When you lift weights, you're actually tearing fibers in your muscles, which is a discomforting process in order for those muscles to build themselves stronger and be more resilient. So that soreness that you experience, and that discomfort you experience when you're running, and your lungs are burning, and you're short of breath. I'm not talking about something extreme or medically wrong. You're actually building your cardiovascular capacity. You're strengthening your heart such that those future runs become less burdensome. You can run longer for a longer period of time at a same pace and not feel as tired. So, both in your physical or in your emotional or in your academic, that discomfort ultimately is preparing your body, your soul, or your person to be stronger, to be more resilient, to be able to adapt to those challenges that we are going to face. And, I'll end it by saying that again, for me, it comes back to, we have one child. So this parenting thing has been a journey and an adventure. And the notion that we have to want to protect our son has to be balanced with this other notion that he does need to fall and make mistakes. And when he was riding his bike many years ago, and he's like, "Dad, stay behind me," I knew at some point I was going to be like, "Nope, I've got to let you go. I'm going to watch you fall. You're going to turn back and I'm not going to be there. And it's going to hurt. And you're going to get your knee skinned up." Was make sure you had your helmet on. But as a result, he now rides his bike without any assistance. And now he can do things out in the world that we still get a little nervous, but have to do that because at the end of the day, that discomfort, that growth, that being uncomfortable with circumstances and situations and us not parachuting in is what he's going to need to navigate this world. And not just to navigate the world, but to be able to hopefully contribute in a way to civil discourse in the future. And then, pay that forward. So that notion of being comfortable with being uncomfortable is something that is easily said, but ultimately that we all have to do if we're going to be able to exist in a society, have civil discourse, and really fight against this trend that we've seen over the past several years, but that is more pronounced, at least in my 53 years on this earth, that I've seen, in our society, in our nation, that has some very serious ramifications if we don't find a different path.
All right.
if
As a
I
quick
may.
wrap up, Carlos and
So
then Elise.
really quickly, I think as I reflect on the question, I think that for some parents, we were the helicopter parents. We bulldozed every issue. We made sure. I'm a college recruiter, so I see parents filling in the information for their kids, for their college kids, asking the question. The kid is in the background, not saying absolutely anything. Everybody gets a trophy. Think about that. Everybody gets a trophy in soccer games and in matches. Everybody wins, And if we start from the young age to helping young people to become resilient, okay, to be able to overcome some of those challenges of losses, then as they grow up, they build upon those so that as an adult, they will be able to hold on to their anger or to their frustration, be able to have a conversation. But if everybody gets a prize by ending last, then they're always going to think that that's good enough. And then we all lose when everything is good enough. We don't benefit from that growth. We don't benefit as a society from that pain that you go through. My daughter one time, she was in I'm sorry to go on a little quickly. She was in karate and she was in a match and she lost. She was in the car and she was crying and I was furious because she got a badge, a medal. She got a medal. She was the last one, and I was furious. And she's crying in the car, and I said, "You don't like that feeling? So get better. You don't like that feeling? Be more attentive. Pay more attention. Focus."
Yeah.
So, and when it comes to civil discourse, these are the challenges that we have to go through. We have to challenge each other.
Respectfully, certainly.
We have to
Yes.
challenge each other and to be able to say, you know what, even though I disagree with you, this is my take, and be able to walk away, shake their hands, and be okay with that.
Yeah. Elise.
Two things. Carlos reminded me of this. My son played sports from the time he was 7 years old through college, and he was a Division I basketball player. And what I saw was that he was more courageous. He was he got used to losses, and the way he approached things was, what did I learn from this? What he learned at that age, it took me a long time in my career, and it was a medical challenge, a serious medical challenge. And when I got back to work, it was like I felt free, because when you're very, very sick, you don't sit back and say, "Gee, when do I go back to work?" How can I go? You go back, you have a very different perspective. And it gave me the courage to sort of challenge some of the things that I would sometimes just bite my tongue about sitting around that table and speak up. And it's those experiences, whether it's the failures, the disappointments, it's what you do after that that helps that. And I think that we need to figure out a way that we can do more of that.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start tonight. So I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Elise Wright, Jay Williams, Carlos Soler. Thank you for your perspectives. There are lots of learnings in the room tonight. I want to call forward Carol. She's going to give us some notes. Thank you.
Okay. Can you all see me? Can you all hear me? I'm Carol Hall with Charter Oak State College Foundation. And this is the part in the program where we want to just say, again, thank you to our panelists. This was so enlightening. I was nodding my head and taking notes. Thank you to Yvonne for putting this together. And then thank you to all of you for coming here tonight. Because if we think about this, when we sat around with the board and the committee and the guest speakers, and we decided to, what does this look like to do civil discourse in community? We were brainstorming. We were asking our guests for input, and we were open-minded to learn. And we came here tonight. You all came out tonight. And I want to thank you and do a round of applause for you, because just by registering and attending and being here, you showed collectively that you care, that we all care about our communities. We want to help to provide a brighter future for families. We want to help provide a brighter future for our communities. And if we take the lessons that we learned and we put them into practice, guess what? It's going to take a little bit of time, but we're going to make a change. So you all are helping to make our vision come to light. So a round of applause for all of you. And then this is like a little commercial break for you. So as many of you know, Charter Oak State College Foundation not only wants brighter futures for our communities, but we also work to educate a more diverse and talented workforce. We provide hope to many parents, students for brighter futures. We know, most of us in this room realize that higher education breaks down social and economic barriers, and Charter Oak State College is Connecticut's all-online public college. It offers the platform that removes time and transportation and for some daycare restraints. So it slashes barriers in half. The foundation provides much needed financial scholarships and resources to help students cross that finish line. I want to thank you today on the line, the people in the Zoom. The Shea family was very generous with their commitment to higher education, and we are grateful. I hope you're online, Jen. And then we also want to thank you in the audience and give you an opportunity to give generously too. Isn't that great? Donations are always appreciated, and there's a QR code in the program. So if you find this beneficial and you understand the impact a college degree can have on a community, or even a Shea lecture experience can have on a community, we give you the opportunity to give. Because, drum roll, because we had such an overwhelming response to the Shea lecture on civil discourse, we're actually extending this to additional series. So in 2025, we've invited the Secretary of State, Stephanie Thompson, to participate. We had the New Britain Chamber of Commerce approach us to host a Shea lecture of this magnitude at the college. And then we also would look forward to working with the Braver Angels to host a workshop with our students and community called Depolarizing Within. So that's our little commercial break for tonight. And we're so excited that you're all here. And now back to our scheduled program. I ask Yvonne, please come up and share with the folks the details of this table talk exercise. Joyce and I will be passing out your questions.
Yeah. So for those of you who are online, want to say thank you again for your participation. For those of you as well in the room, we're going to actually nosh with a purpose. So when we were planning this, we thought about the whole cocktail hour and networking and talking about, well, where do your kids go to college? And, oh, look at the beautiful foliage outside. And instead we thought, let's continue the theme and the opportunity for learning. So as Carol noted, there are questions that are going to be passed around to each table. And as hors d'oeuvres are being passed, and you'll have the opportunity to come up and get a mocktail or get coffee, we're hoping that you will engage in civil discourse right at your tables to share your perspectives and experiences based upon the topic that's in your envelope. For those of you that are online, there is a question that's going to be put into the chat, and we are hoping for those that are online, you'll be automatically placed in breakout rooms. I understand that we have about 100 folks online, which is amazing. We have 25 breakout rooms for folks to go into and engage in this table talk exercise virtually. So with that, the hors d'oeuvres are on their way, which is fantastic. Thank you all for being great listeners, great learners, and building community one courageous civil discourse at a time. Enjoy the conversations, and myself, Carol, as well as Joyce will be around. Flag us if you're getting stuck. Flag us if things are getting a little tense or heated. We're glad to come to your table and help out, but enjoy the food, enjoy the community, and your civil discourse. Thank you so much. Oh, yes. Thank you. One last thing I almost forgot to mention. Thank you so much, Joyce. On your tables is best practices for courageous, civilized conversations. This was developed between my team as well as Charter Oak State College Foundation. Let this help guide your conversations tonight. And certainly, as the holiday season is coming up, this can help you if you get stuck with perhaps that family member that you'll be having maybe some challenging conversations with. We hope that it's helpful. Thank you. Food.